So let me go into the global forces, and I think I want to put the sort of today in terms of history. And I could go back further in Chinese history, at least another 2,000 years, but I think the Qin dynasty is where I think I'll start. And this is when I marked this out because the Silk Road was just beginning to be done. And it's interesting that the Silk Road was starting when we have this new One Belt, One Road initiative by the Chinese government, which in a sense is the new Silk Road that we're driving ahead of things. And then we have in the period of 600, the fall of the Roman Empire. That was a pretty important period of time in the world. About 1100, when we had the improvement in agriculture, we had Genghis Khan, who was doing all sorts of things across the world. Was a very important period of time. 1500 was another very big inflection point in the world. That's when, in a sense, North America and South America were discovered, at least by Europe. For all we know, maybe China had discovered them, and we just haven't found the documents yet. I wouldn't be surprised. But the point is that was a very big shift in terms of another part of the world coming into the system, and a technology shift with the printing press coming into play. And then 1750 to 1850 was what we call the first industrial revolution, machinery being done for weaving and so forth, the locomotive, the steam engines and so forth, which led to the first time to a GDP growth rate which had been very small, less than 1%, to 2 to 3%, which led to dramatic shifts. So we've picked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 periods that we think were pretty amazing times to be in. We think we're in another one of those times right now, that this is the time that you're leading in, and I'll explain why we think that's the case. And there's 5 sort of forces that we think are changing the world in a very significant way. So I'm going to go through each of these 5 for the next 10 minutes or so. The first is the rise or re-rise of the emerging markets, and I call it the re-rise of Asia. And Africa I'm going to talk about as well, which is a very significant part of the world and will be even more so in the next 15 to 20 years. One of the ways to describe the economic power shift that's going on is if we were to put the earth, the world, on a flat piece of paper. Let's just put the world that way. We lay it out and then try to balance it based on where the GDP was, and that gives a sense of where the center of power is. In the year 0, if we went back to that chart, I talked about before, the eras, the center of the world was somewhere north of Afghanistan, right? China and India were the 2 big economic powers. The Europe hadn't really come onto the scene. North America hadn't really developed much. There was some activities going on, but in terms of economic power, wasn't there. So you'd balance the world in Afghanistan. Over a 2,000-year period, the weight of the world, as Western Europe grew, the Industrial Revolution happened, North America was discovered, the center of the world moved to Iceland. That, in the period basically 1950, you'd basically balance the world in Iceland. So the power shifted to the West. What's happening, and this is what's I think quite important from this chart, is that basically in a 75-year period, we're going to go back to where we were 2,000 years ago in terms of economic power. So and the world is obviously a lot bigger today than it was in the year 0. The ability of this power shift to move so much economics in such a short period of time is what is going to be one of the biggest forces that's going on. And this is driven by the re-rise of Asia and the rise of Africa as we move ahead. Already today, if you look at the Fortune 500, we're seeing the number of Asian companies doubling, right? Today I met with a Fortune 3 company. It was Sinopec. Fortune 2, sorry. The second largest company on earth is Sinopec. And when you see the scale and issues of what they do, it's incredible what happens. And we're going to see more of that. Over the next 10 years, more than half of the billion-dollar-plus companies in the world will come from Asia, more than half. You just think about, again, the companies. And that's why, for those of you who do not come from China and here in the audience, I applaud you, because you're in the right place to be for where the future is going to be in terms of the economic shifts that are going on. The biggest driver of why we're going to see that power shift from the west to the east in terms of economics is because of urbanization. More and more people in China, but particularly India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, are moving from rural areas to cities, and it's like gravity. And if there's only one number that I hope you remember from this entire presentation, it's that we predict there will be 2.2 billion new middle-class consumers in the next 10 to 15 years. 2.2 billion new middle-class consumers. We have never seen that number of people shift from a very lower income level to a middle class level in that frame of mind. That's 1,000 times faster than the last industrial revolution. And it's mainly coming, as you can see here, from Asia Pacific, but it's also coming as well from the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. But Asia Pacific plays an extremely important part of that. And that urbanization is, in my view, very much a force of gravity. If you just take China, during the SARS crisis, we still saw 18 million people a year moving from rural areas to cities. During H1N1, we saw, I think it was 19 million people moving through the system. Through the great financial crisis, even when the party says we don't want so many people move, it's a force of gravity. And China is much more urbanized today than it was even 10 years ago, but I'll show you some numbers. They have a long way to go. India is much earlier in the time frame, Indonesia's earlier in the time frame, and Africa's even earlier, but it's coming. And we know the results of when that does happen. So that's one of the drivers of this change. This is the chart I meant to show you, which is, it shows the relationship between urbanization and wealth creation, GDP per capita, and you see this line. And you can see China has actually moved quite fast, but it's a long way to go. Now we're at about, I think it's roughly here at this point, but it's a long way to go compared to these other countries here, which is going to drive growth. And that's why I'm bullish on China. When people get worried about what's going to happen in the economy, there's going to be volatility. But what I say to our clients in the West is you're going to see, at least for the next 10 to 15 years, underlying strong growth. It won't be a nice straight line. It's going to bounce, but it's moving in that direction. This is a picture I like to show. It's of what Shanghai looked like in 1990. That's Pudong. As I say, for my U.S. friends, we call it Poo Jersey because it's across the river from it. And that's what it looks like in 2004, and then another 10 years later. And you just see the speed with which a city changes. And that's happening in well over 100 cities just in this country, let alone what's happening in other parts of the world. So if we now are taking photos in a place called Bogor in West Java in Indonesia, Puducherry in India, and Anchon and Guizhou, and I could talk of a number of different places. You just see a fairly underdeveloped city which is becoming a very significant city. So it's around cities that matter. Africa is another one. When you look at a map of Africa on the Mercator projection, it doesn't look very big. It looks sort of the size of Greenland, right? But actually, when you look at Africa, it is massive, right? We can put the United States, Argentina, India, Western Europe, China, Scandinavia, and you've still got room left over. So just the scale of this place is something that we underestimate. It's 21% of the world's landmass, 1.1 billion people, 64 million people with more than 64 cities with more than 1 million people, and obviously a huge amount of the world's resources. Think about this, 82% of the phosphates, which is critical for agriculture, which I'll come back to. The unused arable land. Ethiopia is becoming very quickly one of the highly urge you to spend time in Africa. Spend time getting to know people in Africa because they're going to be your business peers over time. We have many people, especially in the West, have an ancient view of Africa as a corrupt, backward, broken place. And for those people, they just haven't been to Africa recently. The dynamism of Africa reminds me of Asia in the early 1990s when I was here. So it's a place I would recommend spending time as you think about your career. One of the challenges with this rise or re-rise of the emerging markets is we're going to have a fairly big strain on global resources. We're going to see, for example, water demand could rise by as much as 50%. We did an estimate in McKinsey looking at all the water basins and looked at supply and demand. And our estimate was by 2030 there would be a excess demand versus supply of water by 40%. So water is going to be a very strategic resource as we move ahead. Energy will also be important, needs to rise 50%, and agriculture as well. Now, it may seem strange to say this when commodity prices are at a low right now. My personal view is that low is not a sustainable level because those 2.2 billion people that are coming into the system want to eat and live like middle-class people in other places, and they will consume a lot of phosphates and copper and energy. And I don't think we have the resources and the efficiency we're using today to be able to do it. So we're going to see commodity price increases over time in the long term, which will be different than what we saw over the last 50 years. And that may not look like that today, but if you have a medium to long-term view, it will. And so thinking about how we manage those resources will be important. In 2007, it took basically 1.5 planet resource years to basically feed and fuel the world. By 2030, we think it'll be 2, and by 2050, it will be 3. And obviously, we can't do that. So this is where resource efficiency is going to be a very important part of what we do.